at Norfolk Harbor to say we're throwing Obamacare into the harbor just like our ancestors threw that tea into the harbor.
The Tea Party movement in Hampton Roads. What's it all about, and what does it hope to accomplish? Tonight, a conversation with the group's local leaders. This is What Matters. Good evening, I'm Cathy Lewis. She says she had no idea in February of 2009 that her little three-person protest in Florida would make much difference. But when Mary Rakovich, an unemployed auto engineer, was asked to be on Fox News, a movement was born. Before long, the Tea Party was stirring things up and getting lots of credit along the way for propelling a Republican to the Senate seat held by Ted Kennedy for decades, for forcing Florida's governor, the Republican, to run for the Senate as an independent because Tea Party support went to his opponent, and finally for getting all 6 2nd District Republican hopefuls to appear at a Tea Party candidate forum here in Hampton Roads. No question about it, the Tea Party is making a difference. A Washington Post ABC News poll in April found that 27% of Americans are supportive of the movement, 17% strongly so. Back on April 15th, Tea Party supporters rallied at Town Point Park in Norfolk. Thousands gathered to hear a dozen speakers opposed to much of what's coming out of Washington. Bill Bartell covered the protest for the Virginian pilot. He reports signs that read, "I will not be a slave to the government," and "You don't work, you don't eat." There was talk of tyranny, freedom, and liberty. And there was a warning for incumbents standing for midterm elections in the fall. A CBS News New York Times poll in April showed the movement is mostly male, mostly white, and mostly conservative. But we like to think Hampton Roads bucks the trend in lots of ways, and the Tea Party movement is no exception. Our guests tonight are more demographically diverse than surveys would reflect, and in the course of our conversation, we'll find out where they agree and where they part company. Joining us tonight, Miner Hurd, the co-founder of the Hampton Roads Tea Party, Bishop E.W. Jackson, who spoke at that rally on April 15th, and Robert Dean, who's with the Virginia Beach Taxpayers Alliance and the chair of the Libertarian Party in Hampton Roads. Thanks for being with us tonight, all of you.
Appreciate it. Thank you.
So, Robert Dean, we joked before we went on the air that you and I were here when the dinosaurs roamed the earth. And I've known you for 150 years as the chair of the Libertarian Party and the chair of the Virginia Beach Taxpayers Alliance. So do you feel with the development of the Tea Party movement, where are your organizations, the ones that you have represented for so long, where are they in that continuum?
Well, I think they're right in the heat. We were on the cutting edge of the Tea Party movement before it became the Tea Party, with Ron Paul and Harry Brown and others trying to fight this big government. And we're so happy that Karen and others put this all together, and now we've been able to join forces and coalesce our efforts. And the bishop was absolutely correct. What's going on with the federal government right now and what outrages so many Americans is the only difference is King George was then, this Congress now, they're not wearing wigs today.
But you've, as you said, you've been at this for a long time. Is it worse now, in your view, than it has been? I mean, has there been something that has shifted here from your perspective?
Oh, it's totally worse. I grew up in a period of time that if I had a loaf of bread, I would break the bread and offer to my neighbor who had no bread. Today, the government wants to force me to break bread, and when government forces you to do anything, and we have an out-of-control government, it's no longer charity. So that's a real problem I think that we're all having, and that's why the revolution has begun.
Miner Hurd, co-founder of the Tea Party movement in Hampton Roads. What's your history around this issue? How do you burst onto the stage at this moment? What formed you along the way?
Well, TARP was the last straw. I think there'd been a growing dissatisfaction with things, but then you have the TARP in September 2009, and it was amazing. They didn't listen. I mean, they really didn't listen, and people were really upset and very clear, don't go there. But people were waiting out through the election and watching President Obama's inauguration. I thought, well, you know, it's a big nation. Sometimes when you feel the weight of the presidency, no. He went way off the deep end, and we got this massive stimulus bill, and then we had And then it was Rick Santelli. I've been wanting to do, I never liked taxes, and I've been wanting to do a Tea Party for quite a few years. And Rick Santelli makes the charge on CNBC, you know, there ought to be a Tea Party. And I went, oh, it's time. And I went to my husband and I said, I think I want to do a Tea Party. And he said, okay, but just one. And I started the group, and literally within 10 minutes, I had my co-founder. Yeah. And but we were off. And ironically, I'm going to disagree with the CBS poll here. Over half of the Tea Parties were started by women, mothers in particular, who the very gut sense that we had was we did not raise our children so you could steal their futures. And
just when you say steal their futures, what do you mean by that?
Well, through taxation and excessive debt, and completely irresponsible finances, and on top of that, the tyranny that comes because the government's saying you have to do this, you can't do that, you have to do this, you can't do that. We're saying we didn't raise our children to not have a future. This is the first generation, and surveys have shown that Americans now feel for the first time in our history that our children will not have it better than we did. That's a profound shift that Robert alluded to.
And as you think about this issue from the perspective of what you hope to accomplish, you know, we live in a community that when you talk about government spending, you cannot deny the fact that this community in which we live, 1 out of every $2 we have in this community is generated out of the federal government, out of defense spending. So as you look at that budget and you look at what you've described as the overspending, where do you see the overspending, and what would you cut?
Sure. First off, the Constitution enumerates or says you can spend on this, A, B, C, X, Y, Z. One of those is the common defense. So that doesn't mean, of course, that the government can spend whatever it wants anywhere at any time on defense without any fiscal restraint. But I say to people, you know, when a pastor gives a sermon, he or she has to prove in a Bible where they get their text from. Well, we need to have the same thing back with our legislation. Where in the Constitution, ladies and gentlemen of the Congress, do you have the authority to propose such and such a law? Amen. So federal spending is they are spending in places not enumerated, not specifically detailed by the founders. Federal education is one. There's no federal Department of Education. The founder said the closer to the public, the closer to home,
so the Department of Education will be one place to
and
go.
that was started by Jimmy Carter, and it can leave. It's a complete
Are there
waste of money.
Are there other government agencies that you would
EPA.
do away? Okay.
We are not. Our dependence on foreign energy has actually increased since the Department of Energy was formed. You've also got spending in areas. You've got, why are we giving money to dictators? Why are we propping up all these governments? How much money do we spend on foreign aid? We pay 22% of the budget of the UN. Let's just say we could probably cut it by more than 50% without hurting our allies or hurting our responsibility in the world.
Bishop Jackson, I'm glad to have you with us as well. Boy, you were a stirring speaker at that rally, and I referenced diversity and demographics because you did at the rally as well. And you said, look, I'm a black man, and this is how I feel about this.
Sure, this has nothing to do with race. Let me just pick up though on what Karen said. We're sending $600 million to Morocco while Morocco is busy excommunicating, if you will, people from the United States, particularly Christians. What are we doing? So yes, what concerns me most of all is that the mainstream media, by and large, forces that are against this movement that has just like Karen, people just stood up all over the country at once, all thinking in effect the same thing. Yeah, it's time to do something. That this is racial. It is not. But that, you know, she's a housewife and a mother, and these are people who are deeply and profoundly concerned about our country. They see us going in a fiscally irresponsible direction that could lead to a financial train wreck, which could rob our children of their future, and they're trying to do something about it.
And I want to ask you the same question. When you look at that huge government number that we've been talking about, are there wholesale departments that you think don't need to be anymore, or how would you go about this? Because I think everybody who's been in that office has said, and you know, I mean, we had deficit spending under President Bush, we've had deficit spending under President Obama. I mean, you know, it's a tough job. So where would you cut?
Well, the political realities, I realize, make it very difficult to wholesale remove departments. But I would agree with Karen. We are in a position where we need to ask ourselves, do we need a Commerce Department? Do we really need that? Do we need an education department? Really? Do we really need it?
On the federal level.
On the federal level. I think we need to look even at our national security apparatus and ask how much overlap is there? How much duplication is there? I think we've got something like 17 different agencies, and we're finding out they're still not communicating very well. So there's a lot of cutting that could be done, and particularly when our government officials stand up and tell us, you know, we have to tighten our belts and we're going to have to cut back, and then they never find a program they're not willing to spend our money on. It's time to say no.
I think you brought up a good point when you talk about the intersection here of political realities in this, and I think a lot of elected officials who have said, we're going to cut the budget. Well, then we'll cut the budget, but not when it comes to my defense system or my plant or whatever it is. So how do you account for those
can I
realities?
Address that?
Yeah.
Because one of the things we've talked about, at least in the Hampton Roads Tea Party from the get-go, is if you don't change what voters demand, you can't expect representatives to give you something different. So you can't demand from representatives or people running for office things that they have no authority or financial ability to promise. So voters have to say, you know what? And we've said this. We said, look, when it came to the health control, and Virginia was the first state in the nation, it was in part because of the Tea Party Patriot effort, to say mandated insurance here is illegal. And we said to our representatives on lobby day, look, we understand that the feds will pull strings and that they'll pull money. We'll drive through potholes. If they're going to pull federal funds, if they're going to do something and use that as a hostage, we won't have that. So we're okay with that. So we have to be willing to let those political realities change. And I think that they are changing.
So that they know we are prepared to fight with them and stand with them when it becomes difficult.
And so how are you having these conversations then with the candidates? Because I know, Robert Dean, all 6 of them came to your joint event, which that was in itself quite a victory, wasn't it, to get to command that level of attention?
Yeah, there's of course the media has done a superb job of giving coverage to a lot of these, but there's so many things that occur on a local basis with candidates. They make all these promises, and then once they step over the line into Washington, it's as though they morph into another human being that's unrecognizable. And they make all these campaign promises that they never keep. And, you know, when you look at the programs and you're talking about spending, the Cash for Clunkers program, where in the Constitution is it shown where I have to take my tax dollars and give it to the bishop so he can buy a new car, or for Karen to buy a home? It's not there. It's not enumerated whatsoever. And what should be happening is the deregulation should occur at the federal level and put more of the regulations back on to the state's responsibility, and let them be relegated to oversee all of the education. The federal department. There's not a department in the federal government that's qualified to educate our children.
I think about this, and I think about people in this community who are struggling now with Chinese drywall. Okay, you know, these are people who, through no fault of their own, their homes were built with Chinese drywall because there was a shortage of American drywall. At some point, make a decision to import drywall from China. Now there's problems with it. That's probably not something the state can have an agency to deal with in terms of safety, in terms of regulation and that sort of thing. So do you see what I'm saying? I mean, how do you get at that kind of an issue?
I don't think we can't do one fell swoop. There's certainly no way, but we have to agree as a nation to set our course to do those things. And what's interesting is, and I had this conversation with Bill Bartels, was that people have been, reporter for Virginia Pilot, people have been taught to distrust the free market. They've been taught to literally distrust themselves and their abilities. But you know what? We're an amazingly creative nation. We are a nation of entrepreneurs and innovators. And if you give us a problem and you give us the ability to solve it and the self-government to do it ethically, there's another virtue that we have lost as our nation, the ability for self-control. These problems can be solved. There might be appropriate to have an agency that says, you know what, we do much more international trade. There is some in the Constitution about international trade, certainly. But part of it is that to assume that the federal government must because we can't is an error of thought that's existed for about 100 years.
And that's how America was built. It was not built by an overweening government. It was built on the entrepreneurial, innovative spirit of the American people. And we have to remember Thomas Jefferson's warning: a government that is big enough to give you everything you need is big enough to take everything you have. So the more dependence you create, the more you lose your freedom.
But didn't Jefferson also advocate for essentially blowing everything up every 20 years or so and saying, you know, you can't cling to, that probably wasn't what he said, by the way, blowing everything up.
He said a
probably
revolution.
Not what he said. Yeah, but so his idea was these documents that were created in time are not going to be valid because times change, history, you know, times proceed.
I don't know that Jefferson saw it quite that way, or that he believed that, you know, that we needed to have a literal revolution. I mean, remember, many of the founding fathers lived well into the 19th century.
But a lot of the issues we're dealing with, I guess the point is, a lot of the issues we're dealing with, talk about you just couldn't have even imagined in the 18th century.
But the principles, it is the founding principles that matter. And what we are witnessing is not someone saying, okay, here's how we apply this principle today. What they're saying is, we don't care about those principles. Forget them. We're going to do something entirely different now. As one congressman said when asked about the Constitution, oh, we don't even worry about whether it's constitutional or not.
And you know, it's interesting, if you go, and part of the problem is Americans don't really know their history in depth. They don't know, for example, that there was a benevolent empire, a network of churches and charitable organizations that took care of the social ills because it was not perceived to be the role of government. It was perceived to be the role of churches and communities.
Do you believe that that can happen in a society as large as ours? I mean, that's the other argument, that that was a much smaller scale and you could say that would work.
But you certainly can. But there has to be, along with the governmental shift, we've done a cultural shift. You know, every time there's a government program to do something, let's just do unemployment, which people just don't realize that that's a redistribution of wealth from employers to people who they let go. Do you know that an employer is taxed both when they hire you on the wages and then when they let you go, they're taxed for firing you or for letting you go. So that's why hiring is so off, because of the amount of taxes that are there. But what happens is people say, well, you know, Robert's out of a job, but he's getting unemployment, so he's going to be fine. Therefore, I don't have any responsibility to my neighbor. The church says I don't have any responsibility to our neighbors. And I've said this, not to you, Bishop Jackson, but to many pastors, is where is your church helping people with health insurance that really need it? Where is your church teaching people how to have unemployment insurance themselves? Do you know of a single financial planner that says, well, you know, government's going to take care of you? Heavens no. They tell you all. You must have 3 to 6 months to even a year's salary saved up to protect yourself.
And in the, you know, if we think about Social Security for a moment, that was never envisioned to be the full retirement plan. So, you know, so one can argue that that program itself wasn't designed to be something that was going to be the bedrock of your retirement. And I guess I wonder, when we think about size and scale, when we have a tremendous impact that's going to be felt by these baby boomers who are getting ready to retire. I myself will not be retiring until I'm 95, apparently at this rate, but they are starting to retire. This is going to cause some dramatic changes across the spectrum.
Fewer workers paying in.
So how do we manage that from your perspective? What do we do about that? About workers who have paid into a system that they expect to be there as their safety net when they retire? Are we going to have means testing? What are we going to have?
Well, I think we've got to look at all of these programs and ask the question, what makes sense going forward? And I think you're right. I think we've got to now begin to look to the private sector, look to ourselves. And look, do you remember governmental dependence and confidence in government was such that all George Bush had to do was mention the possibility of privatizing even a portion of your Social Security, and people went ballistic. Well,
do you think that's a good idea?
Absolutely. We've got to consider that. Sure, you build wealth for yourself, for your family, that you can then pass on, as opposed to paying into the government, into a non-existent lockbox.
And so what do you do about people who are, I mean, because I got to tell you, I have a retirement plan. I look at this thing and, you know, I'd like to think I'm a reasonably intelligent person. Sometimes it's confusing. So I think about this person who's illiterate, who's trying to work 2 or 3 jobs to make a living. What's that person going to do in that scenario if we privatize it? the numbers would suggest we've got to do something.
Well, see, I don't think any of us is suggesting that, you just stop helping anybody. I think the American people understand that if there are people who absolutely cannot help themselves for whatever reason, that we don't want to just leave them in the streets in the gutter. We're going to do something as a society. We're going to agree as a society that we ought to do something for them. But that's a very, very small number.
And the other thing, too, is when you talk about illiteracy, illiteracy is often a product of, dare I say it, government education. So you've got people who are illiterate, and yet they've got high school diplomas. And the other thing is when I think about money, and there's a man, Robert Kiyosaki, who's written about this. He wrote a book called Conspiracy of the Rich. He wrote Rich Dad, Poor Dad. And the difficulty with why money is so confusing is it never used to be. When we had a gold-based system, you could plan for your future. You didn't have all these thousands of financial products, which are confusing because in part of government regulation, and I believe that the system has been unnecessarily complicated.
So from an organizational perspective, I hear what you're saying, Robert Dean, I've heard what you've said since the dawn of time. How are you going to put, and I mean that with respect and affection, and you know that,
sure.
But how do you pull all of these groups together? Because it seems to me there are quite a number of them that are sort of under this umbrella called the Tea Party movement. So how do you look at this? Because you've been organizing for a long, long time. So how do you accomplish
and you
that?
hit on it when you brought up the subject of education. Unfortunately, our children are not being educated in the basic principles of this nation, which is the Constitution, the Bill of Rights, and of course the Declaration of Independence. The great thing about the Constitution, probably the greatest thing, is it allows all human beings in this nation to make stupid mistakes. And it also is supposed to be there to prevent the government from interfering in our lives, and they are now out of control. If you look over a span of about 40 to 45 years of what you contribute to to your retirement fund in the so-called Social Security, what you could make in the private sector is mind-boggling in comparison. So we need to set up a line of demarcation and tell the next generation coming up, this will no longer be here. You'll be able to take everything you put into it and go and invest it. And along with that, we're going to eliminate the income tax and the IRS through the fair tax, a consumption tax. That's going to put out the level playing field. This is the only thing that's going to save this nation right now. We are teetering on the edge of bankruptcy, and I don't think anybody really sees it except maybe the folks around this table.
And poor and minority people who have been told, don't go near the Tea Party, they're a bunch of racists. They're the first ones who will be hurt when there is a financial crisis in this country.
They have no margin.
They're the first ones to be hurt. They ought to be involved more than anybody else.
One of the things that I've heard all of you say this to varying degrees, and I think you just said it pretty clearly, Robert Dean, is a fear that the country is on the brink. And I hear this a lot. Is financial collapse your most major concern?
If you look at the management of any country, and let's take Greece right now, and the pigs, Portugal, Italy. Now the European Union is going to be dumping trillions of dollars into a country that is totally mismanaged. Nothing's changed. We have mismanaged this nation, so if we're going to continue to throw more money, debt after bad debt, what's the end result? Look what we have.
We have just a few moments left,
Okay.
and I hate to throw this question out at this moment. We have 1 minute left. Given that you described as a duopoly, Republican-Democrat, what are you going to do if a Tea Party candidate doesn't win in some of these elections that are coming up?
We're going to continue just like we are. We're not going to be swayed one way or another, because right now we're looking for the second party. Right now we only have one party, and that's the Republicrats. There's no difference between the Democrats and Republicans except different colored wings. And the Libertarian Party, we're strict constitutionalists, and hopefully we're going to find some candidates out of this big movement that are going to take those constitutional principles and run with them
Well,
and
I
get
don't quite
elected.
subscribe to that view, but
Yeah.
I believe that the Republican Party is very distinct from the Democrat Party, not only on the financial issues,
Will you
but on
line
the
up behind
on the
Republicans
social
if your Tea
issues.
Party candidates don't win?
Yes, but we must hold them accountable. We must hold their feet to the fire. Say, you claim to be a conservative, we expect you to go in there and behave like a conservative would behave.
I want to thank all of you for being with us.
Thank you,
it's been
Cathy.
a pleasure talking with
Thank
you, and
you.
I appreciate this opportunity to let folks know more about this movement. Because, you know, we hear this word movement, it's a really sort of one of these umbrella words, and I always like to meet the people behind the words, because I think then we understand it better. I'll be back in a moment with a final thought and a true confession. It's time for some good old-fashioned truth-telling about the latest in mobile phones, the advent of widespread texting. I'm not going to lie, texting is tempting, and I'm willing to bet there are more than a few of us who've started a text message before our vehicles come to a full and complete stop. There's just something compelling about those 160 characters that lets us move a project along, or advise a friend that we're running late, or confirm our vitally important plans for the weekend. But growing numbers of people, especially young people, are texting behind the wheel while the car is moving. Some are even texting on bicycles. If you've ever seen a young person with a texting phone, then you know they are freakishly fast and accurate typists. The trouble is they're a little too confident, so much so that they think they can text and drive or bike without consequence. But it's not just young people who are tempted by texting. The folks at Car and Driver magazine have found that texting and driving is more dangerous than drinking and driving. And that's why the City of Newport News turned its students loose to create a powerful new public service announcement it hopes will save lives. Powerful stuff. Thanks for joining us for this edition of What Matters. We'll see you again soon.